My name is Gwendolyn and I am 28 years old. As a data privacy consultant with Swiss and US citizenship, I always knew how to secure valuable information. But I never realized the biggest threat to my security was sitting across the dining table. After a massive fight at my in-laws' anniversary dinner, my husband Declan looked me straight in the eyes and snapped, "Apologize right now, or pack your bags and get out." Instead of begging for forgiveness, I bought one-way tickets out of the country for me and my son Leo. By the time his toxic family realized we had vanished, it was already too late and the blood drained from their faces when they realized what I took with me. Before I explain exactly how I dismantled their fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever set a firm boundary with toxic in-laws. The nightmare erupted at my parent-in-law's anniversary dinner. Beatrice and Richard rented the private dining room of a high-end French restaurant downtown, sparing no expense to impress their incredibly wealthy friends. Waiters circulated with expensive champagne under crystal chandeliers. It was a masterclass in performative wealth, the exact illusion my husband family lived for. I sat near the middle of the long table wearing a vintage cream silk dress that belonged to my late Swiss mother. My 4-year-old son Leo sat beside me clutching my hand. The restaurant was loud, filled with booming laughter and a jazz band. Leo has always been sensitive to sensory overload, especially unpredictable noises. He is not delayed. He just gets overwhelmed and needs quiet to recalibrate. He pressed his face against my arm, trying to block out the cacophony. I was gently stroking his hair, whispering softly, just trying to make it through the dessert course so we could finally go home. That was when my sister-in-law Madison made her move. Madison was the undisputed golden child, treating every social gathering as a runway to showcase her supposed superiority. She carried herself with arrogant entitlement, constantly seeking her parents' validation. Madison walked back to her seat holding a full glass of Cabernet. As she passed behind my chair, she deliberately stumbled. I felt the cold splash before I even saw it. A wave of dark red wine cascaded over my shoulder, ruining the delicate cream silk of my dress. I gasped, jumping up as the cold liquid soaked through to my skin. Madison never even dropped her glass. She simply stood there, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Oops," she said loudly. My hand slipped. Maybe if your kid was not constantly whining and distracting everyone, I would have watched my step. Leo whimpered, frightened by the sudden commotion. He buried his face in my side, trembling. Madison rolled her eyes dramatically, waving her manicured hand toward my son. "Seriously, Gwendolyn," she scoffed, pitching her voice loudly. "You really need to get that kid evaluated. He is clearly developmentally delayed. It is embarrassing. He cannot even handle a simple dinner party without acting like a defective toddler." A heavy silence fell over our section of the table. Beatrice and Richard simply watched, offering no reprimand to their daughter. My husband Declan just swirled his whiskey, looking annoyed that my ruined dress was causing a scene. For 4 years I had bitten my tongue to keep the peace. I had tolerated the condescending remarks about my remote job, the snide comments about my heritage, and the constant implication that I was not good enough for their family. But attacking my innocent 4-year-old son was the final straw. The professional restraint I practiced daily as a privacy consultant vanished, replaced by an icy fury. I grabbed a napkin and dabbed the wine off my dress, keeping my movements deliberate. I looked back at Madison, who clutched her brand new designer handbag, waiting for me to lower my head and apologize. Instead, I let out a sharp, cold laugh. Developmentally delayed, I repeated, my voice cutting through the remaining chatter in the room. "My son is simply overwhelmed by the noise. But speaking of severe delays, Madison, how is your credit score doing these days?" Madison's smug smile froze instantly. Her eyes darted nervously toward her husband Terrence, a senior auditor sitting a few seats down, looking completely and utterly bewildered. I tossed the wine-soaked napkin onto the table and took a step toward her. "I know you love showing off that new handbag to everyone here tonight." I continued, raising my voice so her parents' wealthy friends could hear every word. "But I am just curious. Did you tell your parents about the massive line of credit you secretly opened to afford it? Or the fact that you are currently drowning in $30,000 of hidden credit card debt just to pretend you can afford this fake lifestyle? The blood drained from Madison's face. Her jaw dropped, clutching the handbag as if I had struck her. As the data privacy expert who managed our family network, I accidentally saw the unencrypted loan approvals she downloaded to the shared server last week. She had hidden the debt from everyone, especially her financially meticulous husband, Terrence. The entire dining room fell dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. The jazz band in the corner completely faded away. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace in horror, looking frantically at her country club friends who were now whispering behind their menus. Richard turned beet red, staring at his daughter in shock. Terrence dropped his fork, his eyes narrowing as he stared at his wife, the realization of her financial betrayal sinking in. I stood my ground in my ruined dress, holding my son close, watching the carefully curated fake facade of their perfect family crumble into dust right in front of my eyes. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute and suffocating. No one moved a single muscle. The wealthy guests at the surrounding tables stared with wide eyes, their expensive meals completely forgotten on their porcelain plates. Madison stood frozen in place, her face drained of all color, her knuckles turning stark white as she gripped the leather of her designer handbag. Beside her, Terrence slowly turned his head. I could see the rigid tension in his jaw, the terrifying stillness of a man who just realized his entire financial life was a carefully constructed lie. But before Terrence could demand answers from his panicking wife, a chair scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor. Declan shoved his seat back with enough force that it toppled over with a loud, echoing crash. His face was a mask of dark, pulsing rage. The thick vein in his neck throbbed aggressively as he marched across the private dining room. He did not look at his sister. He did not look at the stunned guests. His furious gaze was locked entirely on me. I was still kneeling slightly, using a fresh linen napkin to dab the spilled Cabernet off my 4-year-old son. Leo was trembling against my shoulder, terrified by the sudden explosive aggression radiating from his father. Declan closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He reached out and violently snatched the napkin right out of my hand. He threw it onto the table, shattering a crystal water glass in the process. Water and wine mixed across the white tablecloth. "You have lost your mind!" Declan hissed, leaning over me so his anger was a physical weight pressing down. His voice was low at first, a venomous growl, but as he realized the entire room was watching, his narcissistic need to assert absolute dominance took over. He straightened his posture and raised his volume, making sure every single person in the room heard him clearly. "You are going to look at my sister right now and beg for her forgiveness," he demanded, pointing a rigid, aggressive finger at my face. "You are making up vicious, insane lies to embarrass my family because you are jealous of Madison. You are going to apologize to her this exact second." Or what I asked. My voice did not shake. I did not raise my pitch. I simply looked up at the man I had married, the man who was currently screaming at me while his young son cowered in fear. "Or, you can pack your bags and get out of my house tonight," Declan roared. The ultimatum echoed off the high-painted ceilings of the restaurant. "If you cannot respect my family, you do not belong in our home. Apologize right now or pack your bags and get out." I slowly stood up, pulling Leo tightly into my arms. My son buried his face in my neck, his little hands gripping the ruined silk of my dress. I expected Declan to flinch, to realize he had just threatened to throw his wife and child onto the street over a spilled glass of wine and a bruised ego. Instead, his chest puffed out. He crossed his arms, standing tall, waiting for my submission. Before I could even process the absolute finality of his words, Beatrice pushed her chair back and stood up at the head of the table. She smoothed down her designer skirt, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Declan is absolutely right," Beatrice announced, her voice ringing with toxic authority. "We have welcomed you into this family with open arms, Gwendolyn. and you have offered nothing but disrespect and jealousy in return. You sit at home all day playing around with your little computer files, pretending that data privacy is a real career. It is a fake stay-at-home hobby. You bring in pennies while my son breaks his back to give you a life of ultimate luxury. Richard nodded in firm agreement beside her, glaring at me over his half-empty wineglass. Beatrice took a confident step forward, emboldened by her husband and son. "You should be down on your knees thanking Declan for providing for you," she sneered. "You contribute nothing of actual value to this family. You are ungrateful, bitter, and entirely out of line. Madison is a highly successful woman. You are just a bored housewife creating drama for attention. Now do as your husband says. Apologize to my daughter immediately." The air in the room felt incredibly thick, heavy, with the suffocating weight of their collective delusion. They truly believed I was trapped. They looked at my modest background, my quiet demeanor, and my remote job, and they calculated that I was completely dependent on their wealth. Declan stood there, jaw set, waiting for the tears. He was waiting for my voice to break, for me to lower my eyes, to apologize to Madison, and to accept my place at the absolute bottom of their twisted hierarchy. But there were no tears. There was no panic. The love I once held for Declan evaporated in that exact second, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. The emotional attachment severed so cleanly it almost felt physical. I looked at Beatrice, her face flushed with elite indignation. I looked at Madison, who had regained a fraction of her smug confidence now that her brother and mother were relentlessly attacking me. Finally, I looked at Declan. His eyes were hard, demanding my complete surrender. "Not a problem," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not try to defend my career or my worth. I simply tightened my protective hold on my son, turned my back on my husband, and began walking toward the exit. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the dining room. I did not look back. I did not pause. As I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors of the private dining room, I caught a brief glimpse of Declan in the reflection of the glass. He was not following me. He was not calling my name. Instead, Declan was leaning against the edge of the dining table, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He reached out, picked up his glass of whiskey, and took a slow, victorious sip. He was exchanging a highly satisfied look with his mother, thoroughly convinced that he had just won the ultimate power struggle. He fully expected me to sit in the car, cry my eyes out, and come crawling back to the house to beg for his forgiveness by midnight. He had absolutely no idea that by kicking me out, he had just handed me the key to his complete and utter destruction. I walked out into the cool evening air, the heavy restaurant doors closing behind me with a solid, definitive thud, sealing his fate forever. The heavy restaurant doors thudded shut behind me, instantly cutting off the suffocating jazz music and the toxic air of my husband family. The cool night air hit my face sharp and sobering. I carried Leo straight to the valet stand. My son was quiet now, his small arms wrapped tightly around my neck, exhaustion replacing his earlier terror. When the valet brought my car around, I strapped Leo into his car seat with practiced efficiency, kissed his forehead, and slipped behind the wheel. I expected the adrenaline to crash. I expected to grip the leather steering wheel and sob uncontrollably, mourning the definitive end of my marriage. But the tears never came. As I pulled out into the city traffic, my mind shifted into a state of absolute freezing precision. The chaotic emotional fog that usually accompanied Declan outbursts was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp tactical clarity. I drove through the neon-lit streets with my jaw set, mentally organizing the logistics of our immediate disappearance. The drive home was a masterclass in detachment. I did not turn on the radio. I did not look at my phone, which was likely already buzzing with demanding texts from Declan, anticipating my surrender. I simply listened to the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement and the soft, even breathing of my sleeping son in the back seat. We arrived at our sprawling suburban house in record time. The grand columned estate Declan had insisted on buying to impress his commercial real estate colleagues now felt exactly like what it always was, a giant, heavily mortgaged prison built on a foundation of lies. I parked the car in the garage and carried Leo inside. I bypassed the grand foyer mirror where I usually pause to check my composure. I bypassed the living room sofa where I typically sat to process his cruel ultimatums. I carried my sleeping boy upstairs, gently laying him down in his bed, and walked straight into the master suite. I did not reach for the expensive evening gowns Declan bought to show me off, nor did I look at the jewelry he gifted me after his previous temper tantrums. I marched directly into the walk-in closet, reached up to the highest shelf, and pulled down two durable travel suitcases. I threw them onto the center of our massive king-sized bed and unzipped them in one fluid motion. There was zero hesitation. The time for bargaining, for walking on eggshells, for hoping he would change was permanently over. He had given me a choice to pack my bags, and I was going to follow his instructions to the absolute letter. As I systematically pulled practical, sturdy clothing from my drawers, my thoughts drifted to the ultimate trump card Declan had no idea I possessed. My late mother was a fiercely independent Swiss woman. Before she passed away, she instilled in me the absolute necessity of maintaining a private, untouchable sanctuary. Because of her, I hold dual citizenship, a fact Declan knew but casually dismissed as a quirky trivia detail that offered no benefit to his social climbing. What he absolutely did not know, and what I deliberately hid the moment his controlling financial behavior first reared its ugly head years ago, was my inheritance. Tucked away in the pristine, quiet streets of Geneva was a modest, fully paid-off apartment with my name securely on the deed. Accompanying that apartment was a private trust fund in a highly secure Swiss account. Early in our marriage, Declan had insisted on managing all our joint finances. He aggressively scrutinized every single dollar I spent, demanding receipts for groceries, while simultaneously hiding his own massive business losses and luxury expenses. My background as a data privacy consultant taught me to compartmentalize data to survive. When I realized he was using money to trap me, I completely locked down my digital footprint. I kept my Swiss assets entirely off the grid, letting him believe I was totally dependent on his volatile income. It was my invisible armor. Tonight, that secret was going to be our salvation. I moved rapidly into Leo's room, packing a separate bag with his favorite pajamas, a few changes of comfortable clothes, and his most cherished stuffed bear. I abandoned anything bulky, heavy, or replaceable. We needed to be light, agile, and entirely untraceable. I packed exactly like a ghost, preparing to vanish from the physical world. I walked back into my home office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I bypassed our navy blue American passports and reached all the way to the back, pulling out a hidden fireproof envelope. Inside were our two pristine, red Swiss passports. These documents were our golden tickets. They ensured we could cross international borders without triggering the usual tracking alerts tied to our American identities. If Declan tried to track our flight records using our U.S. names and documents, he would find absolutely nothing. I slipped the red passport securely into the hidden interior pocket of my carry-on bag. I grabbed my encrypted backup hard drives, my primary work laptop, and all the physical charging cables we would need to survive off-grid for the next 48 hours. I stood in the hallway, bags fully packed and zipped, staring at the quiet, immaculate house. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the shouting and humiliation I had endured for years. I was almost ready to leave this toxic life forever. But before I could walk out the front door and disappear into the night, I needed one final critical piece of documentation for my son. I left the luggage by the front door and walked down the long carpeted hallway toward Declan's home office. The room was a monument to his fragile ego, walls lined with mahogany bookshelves, a massive oak desk, and framed photographs of him shaking hands with local politicians. I stepped behind the desk and swung open the heavy wooden door of the bottom cabinet. Behind it sat a solid steel biometric safe. Declan changed the passcode every 6 months to assert dominance and control over household matters, but he was fundamentally unoriginal. People who think they are the smartest person in the room always leave predictable patterns. I typed in the digits of his mother's birthday. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a heavy clank. I swung the door open and immediately grabbed the navy blue accordion folder sitting right in the front. I quickly located Leo's original birth certificate and slid it into my pocket. I was about to shut the heavy door when a sliver of dark leather caught my eye. It was wedged in the narrow gap between the back wall of the safe and a stack of property deeds. I reached my hand in and pulled it out. It was a thick black leather-bound ledger, secured shut with a heavy brass combination padlock. I frowned, the cold metal heavy in my palm. Declan was a commercial real estate broker who practically lived on his smartphone. He actively mocked physical paperwork, claiming it was for dinosaurs and entry-level assistants. For him to keep a physical locked ledger in a hidden corner of his safe was a massive behavioral anomaly. As a data privacy consultant, my brain is wired to detect anomalies. When someone goes out of their way to take data completely off the grid, hiding it in a physical analog format, it means they are absolutely terrified of digital footprints. It means the information is highly illicit. I stared at the 3-digit brass lock. 3 dials, 1,000 possible combinations. I did not have time for a brute force attack, but I knew my husband. He was deeply, almost pathologically tied to his toxic family dynamic. I spun the first dial to his sister Madison birth month, the second to his father birth month, the third to his own. The lock remained stubborn. I paused, taking a slow breath, recalibrating my logic. Who was the true architect of his financial life? Who did he answer to? I spun the dials to the exact street address number of Beatrice and Richard sprawling country club mansion. The brass shackle clicked open. My stomach gave a sharp, uneasy lurch. I pulled the lock free, unclasped the leather strap, and flipped the ledger open under the harsh glow of the desk lamp. It was not a traditional accounting book filled with handwritten numbers. The thick leather cover was actually a hollowed-out portfolio binding tightly packed with dozens of pristine, highly organized financial documents. I pulled out the top stack. They were bank statements from a premier wealth management institution, a bank I had absolutely no accounts with. I stared at the name printed in bold black ink at the top of the page. It read, Gwendolyn Privacy Consulting, LLC. My breath caught in my throat. That was my business. That was the remote consulting firm I had built from the ground up, the exact same career Beatrice had just mocked as a fake stay-at-home hobby an hour ago at the restaurant. I quickly flipped to the next page. It was a commercial loan application for $80,000. My eyes darted down to the bottom line. There, written in blue ink, was my signature. It was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate forgery. I traced fraudulent data patterns for massive corporate clients, and looking at this paper, I could immediately see the meticulous care taken to replicate my exact pen strokes. My hands started to tremble not from fear, but from a rapidly rising tide of absolute outrage. I began tearing through the rest of the portfolio, spreading the documents across Declan's immaculate mahogany desk. There were approved applications for massive business lines of credit, aggressive commercial real estate bridge loans, and leveraged asset withdrawals. Every single one was taken out under my name, utilizing my pristine credit score, my impeccable financial history, and the tax identification number of my consulting business. I found routing numbers transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars from these fraudulent accounts directly into accounts owned by Beatrice and Richard. There were massive, unexplainable wire transfers bailing out Declan's supposedly successful commercial real estate firm. They were taking out staggering amounts of debt in my name, funneling the cash into their own pockets to maintain their lavish country club lifestyle and cover Declan business failures. I grabbed a final stack of papers from the back of the ledger. These were different. I recognized the account numbers immediately. They were connected to Leo. When my son was born, Declan insisted on setting up a custodial savings account to begin building his financial future. I had agreed handing over Leo's social security number to establish the trust. Now holding these documents, I saw the true purpose. They had leveraged a 4-year-old child's social security number to secure high-risk predatory personal loans. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. All these years I thought Beatrice, Richard, and Madison simply hated me because I was an outsider. I thought they despised me because I did not come from their elite, snobbish background. I thought Declan tolerated their abuse because he was just a weak, spineless mama boy. I was completely wrong. They did not just dislike me. They were actively, systematically using me. They were financial parasites sucking the lifeblood out of my clean identity to fund their fake empire of wealth. They kept me around isolated and constantly criticized, specifically to ensure I would never feel confident enough to look closely at our household finances. They bullied me to keep me submissive, all while forging my name on documents that carried federal prison sentences. If I had stayed, if I had caved to Declan's ultimatum and apologized to his sister tonight, I would have eventually been buried alive under a mountain of fraudulent illicit debt. When their house of cards inevitably collapsed, they would have let me take the fall. I would be facing federal wire fraud charges while they walked away clean. The cold, analytical part of my brain fully took over. The shock completely evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, deadly focus. They had stolen my identity. They had exploited my innocent 4-year-old son. They had built their entire arrogant, boastful existence on my back, and then had the sheer audacity to treat me like garbage. I did not just have a reason to leave anymore. I had the exact ammunition I needed to absolutely destroy them. I looked down at the forged documents scattered across the desk, my mind already calculating the next sequence of events. I needed to secure this data. I needed to move fast, strike hard, and leave zero trace behind. Declan thought I was just a naive wife packing a bag in defeat. He was about to find out exactly what a data privacy expert does when you compromise her network. I booted up my secure laptop and connected it to my private encrypted hotspot. I did not dare use the house network. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I began cross-referencing the account numbers listed in Declan's hidden ledger. What I uncovered in the next 20 minutes was a staggering, highly coordinated web of corporate fraud. Declan and his mother had not just casually borrowed a few dollars, they had committed massive, systematic identity theft. I stared at the glowing screen as the data populated. They had hijacked the employer identification number of my privacy consulting firm. Beatrice, the woman who had spent the entire evening insulting my career, was listed as a shadow guarantor on 3 separate commercial lines of credit tied directly to my business. They had falsified revenue reports inflating my modest consulting income to look like a multi-million-dollar enterprise, all to secure massive loans from predatory lenders who did not ask too many questions. But the absolute worst discovery, the one that made my blood run cold, was Leo File. Declan had actively weaponized our 4-year-old son. He took Leo's pristine blank slate social security number and manipulated it to establish a secondary credit profile. Because Leo shared Declan's last name, my husband had easily bypassed basic security checks, linking my son's identity to a series of high-yield unsecured personal loans. He used his professional credentials as a real estate broker to bypass the usual age verifications, burying Leo's social security number deep within the paperwork of shell corporations. They had turned my innocent child into a disposable financial shield. I needed to know exactly where all this stolen money was going. I ran a trace on the routing numbers neatly logged in the margins of the ledger. The truth was pathetic. The extravagant anniversary dinner we had just left, the vintage champagne, the custom-tailored suits, the sprawling country club mansion, none of it was funded by Richard's supposedly brilliant investments. It was all a complete mirage paid for by my stolen credit. I found recurring automatic payments for Beatrice luxury SUV leases, Richard exorbitant golf club dues, and even their monthly landscaping bills, all drawn from a fraudulent account illegally opened under my LLC. And Declan, the arrogant hotshot who had just demanded my total submission in front of a crowded restaurant, was the biggest failure of them all. I pulled up the public property records corresponding to the addresses listed on the commercial loan applications. Every single real estate deal he had bragged about at family dinners over the last 3 years was completely underwater. He was a terrible broker. He had been purchasing failing commercial strip malls, entirely miscalculating their value, and instantly defaulting on the payments. To avoid professional ruin and bankruptcy, He was using the illicit funds secured by my business identity to secretly bail out his massive margins. The entire family was running a synchronized Ponzi scheme. They desperately needed me to stay small, quiet, and insecure. They needed me to believe I was dependent on them because my clean financial background and my dual citizenship status were the only things keeping their luxurious, rotting house of cards from completely imploding. Madison hidden credit card debt, which I had exposed at the restaurant, was nothing compared to this. The entire family was financially destitute, wearing designer clothes paid for by federal wire fraud. I leaned back in Declan's heavy leather desk chair, the sheer magnitude of the stakes pressing down on me. I looked closely at the repayment schedules attached to the commercial loans. Two of the largest debts were structured with massive balloon payments that were due in less than 60 days. Declan and Beatrice had absolutely zero liquid capital to cover those payments. They were completely tapped out. If I stayed, if I caved to the fear and walked back downstairs to apologize to Madison like a good, obedient wife, the trap would permanently snap shut. When those balloon payments inevitably defaulted in 2 months, the aggressive lenders would not go after Declan or Beatrice. They would come directly after me. I would be legally responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt. My business, the career I had built with my own hands, would be liquidated. My professional reputation as a data privacy expert would be utterly destroyed, replaced by federal investigations and potential criminal charges. And worse, Leo's financial future would be completely ruined before he even started kindergarten, his credit score destroyed by his own father. Staying in this house was financial suicide. Leaving empty-handed and pretending I saw nothing was equally dangerous. If I just walked away, Declan would continue draining these accounts, leaving me to face the legal fallout alone while he played the victim. I could not just disappear. I had to aggressively rip the power out of their hands, dismantle their fraudulent network, and secure my own safety before they even realized I was gone. The emotional shock was entirely gone now. I did not feel sorrow for my broken marriage, and I certainly did not feel pity for the man sitting at the restaurant, expecting my return. I only felt a cold, relentless drive to protect my son and my hard-earned life. They had severely underestimated the woman they invited into their family. They thought they were dealing with a quiet, submissive target. They forgot that my entire professional life was dedicated to tracking, securing, and weaponizing data. I looked at the piles of paper spread across the desk. It was time to go to work. I reached into the padded compartment of my carry-on bag and withdrew a specialized high-resolution portable document scanner. It was a sleek, matte black device I typically utilized during on-site corporate security audits, designed to capture perfect glare-free images in a fraction of a second. I bypassed the standard overhead lighting, which would cast harsh shadows and angled Declan desk lamp to create a flat, even wash of illumination across the leather blotter. There was zero room for error. Every single signature, every routing number, every fraudulent stamp of approval had to be crystal clear. I began with the bank statements tied to my hijacked business entity. I fed the crisp pages under the scanner wand one by one. The device emitted a soft rhythmic hum, digitizing the evidence of Beatrice and Richard's lavish expenditures funded by my stolen identity. I moved with mechanical, absolute precision. My emotions were locked away behind a firewall of tactical necessity. The woman who had been bullied at the restaurant no longer existed. I was now operating strictly as a data privacy architect, dismantling a hostile threat. After capturing the business loans, I turned to the darkest part of the ledger. I picked up the high-risk personal loan applications secured by Leo's Social Security number. My hands remained perfectly steady as I scanned the documents, but a cold, heavy resolve cemented in my chest. Declan had crossed a line that guaranteed his total destruction. I meticulously captured the front and back of every page, ensuring no fine print or hidden addendums were missed. I grouped the files into organized, sequentially numbered digital folders right on my encrypted desktop. Once the physical scanning was complete, I initiated my most rigorous cybersecurity protocols. I connected my laptop to a private hardware-based encrypted hotspot, completely bypassing the compromised domestic Wi-Fi network Declan had installed in the house. I opened my secure cloud server, an offshore repository protected by zero-knowledge architecture and military-grade AES encryption. I created a new vault, labeling it simply with tonight date. I dragged the massive cache of forged documents, illicit routing numbers, and fraudulent loan applications into the upload queue. I watched the progress bar slide steadily across the screen: 50%, 75%, 100%. The data was now safely off the grid, duplicated and locked behind cryptographic walls that Declan Elementary commercial real estate mind could never hope to breach. With the evidence secured in the cloud, I immediately opened a heavily encrypted peer-to-peer communication portal. I typed in the direct contact address for Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a ruthless, highly connected, white-collar criminal defense attorney based out of Manhattan. I had consulted for his firm 2 years ago, securing their internal client databases against corporate espionage. He owed me a massive favor, and he absolutely despised sloppy financial criminals. I drafted the message with rapid, clinical keystrokes. I did not include any emotional backstory or dramatic marital complaints. I gave him exactly what a predator like Marcus needed to hunt. I outlined the specific federal statutes Declan and his family had violated, detailing the wire fraud, the commercial identity theft, and the egregious abuse of a minor social security number. I attached the encrypted access keys to the cloud vault containing the scanned ledger. My instructions to Marcus were explicit and uncompromising. He was to immediately draft the necessary affidavits and prepare to file aggressive fraud alerts with every major credit bureau and federal lending authority. However, he was under strict orders to hold the deployment until I gave the final automated signal. He was not to engage the authorities or contact Declan until I was officially outside the jurisdiction of the United States. I hit send. The digital packet vanished into the ether. Marcus now held the legal detonator, and I held the remote control. The trap was fully armed. Now I needed to ensure we were thousands of miles away before the explosion leveled the entire family. I closed the communication portal and launched a clean, decentralized browser environment. I routed my connection through a series of international virtual private networks, bouncing my location across servers in Iceland and Germany. If Declan hired a desperate private investigator to pull the router logs from the internet service provider tomorrow morning, they would find absolutely nothing resembling travel arrangements. I navigated directly to the booking portal for a premium international airline. I checked the departure boards for the closest major international airport. I had exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes before a red-eye flight departed straight to Zurich with a seamless private transfer connecting directly to Geneva. It was a tight window, but the logistics were flawless. I selected 2 one-way tickets in the international business class cabin. I did not choose business class for the luxury. I chose it for the tactical advantages it provided for an emergency extraction. The premium tickets guaranteed expedited priority passage through the security checkpoints, keeping Leo and me out of the crowded, highly visible public concourses. It granted us immediate access to the private departure lounges, where we could remain completely isolated behind frosted glass doors until the exact moment of boarding. When the payment screen loaded, I did not touch the joint American credit card sitting in my wallet. Using any card tied to Declan's name would trigger an instant SMS alert to his phone, ruining the entire escape. Instead, I entered the routing details for my secure Swiss account. The funds cleared instantly, leaving a completely invisible financial trail. The booking confirmation materialized on my screen, displaying 2 boarding passes under my maiden name, and Leo legally recognized dual citizen identity. I downloaded the boarding passes directly to my offline local drive and snapped the laptop shut. I slid the machine into my reinforced travel bag. Then I turned my attention back to the mahogany desk. I gathered the physical forged documents, stacked them in their original meticulous order, and slid them back inside the hollowed-out leather binding. I closed the cover, threaded the leather strap through the brass padlock, and squeezed the shackle shut. I spun the 3 dials randomly, securing the lock. I placed the ledger back into the precise dusty corner of the biometric safe where I had found it, closed the heavy steel door, and listened to the bolts slide into the locked position. Declan would return to an empty house completely unaware that his hidden financial guillotine was already counting down to zero. I walked out of the home office and never looked back. I hoisted the two perfectly packed suitcases, carried them down the silent hallway, and quietly loaded them into the trunk of my SUV. I retrieved Leo from his bed, keeping his small, warm body wrapped tightly in a thick fleece blanket. He barely stirred as I secured him into his car seat for the second time that night. The garage door opened with a muted mechanical hum, and I backed out of the driveway, leaving the massive, fraudulent suburban estate completely dark. The drive to the international terminal was a blur of highway lights and steady rain. I parked in the long-term executive garage, completely abandoning the vehicle. Declan could spend his precious time tracking it down later. Right now, every second was a vital commodity. I transferred Leo to his travel stroller, stacked our bags onto a metal cart, and pushed our entire remaining physical life toward the sliding glass doors of the departure hall. The terminal was a cavernous, echoing space at this hour, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. The late-night crowds were sparse, mostly exhausted business travelers and red-eye tourists. We bypassed the winding, chaotic economy check-in lines completely. I steered the cart directly toward the exclusive international business class priority lane. A polished airline agent greeted me with a professional smile, asking for our travel documents. This was the critical juncture. I reached into my jacket pocket and handed over the two pristine red Swiss passports. I did not present our American identification. I did not use the last name Declan had so arrogantly demanded I adopt. The agent scanned the biometric chips, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She did not blink. She did not ask secondary questions. The system registered us entirely as returning Swiss citizens. She handed me our boarding passes and politely directed us toward the expedited security checkpoint. We moved through the priority security lane in less than 5 minutes. There were no invasive questions, no random searches, and no delays. The red passports acted exactly as my mother had promised, rendering us practically invisible to domestic tracking algorithms. Declan could hire the most expensive private investigators in the city, but they would be searching for an American woman and her child. They would be searching for ghosts. Once through the checkpoint, we did not linger in the duty-free shops or the public concourse. I navigated straight to the private airline lounge. The heavy frosted glass doors slid open, granting us access to a quiet, dimly lit sanctuary, completely isolated from the main terminal. I found a secluded booth in the far corner, tucked away from the main dining area and shielded by a decorative wooden partition. I settled Leo onto the plush leather seating, covering him with his fleece blanket. He was deeply asleep, completely unaware that his entire world was fundamentally shifting. I checked the departure screens, monitoring the flight status. We had 45 minutes until boarding. I ordered a black coffee from the lounge attendant and sat in the quiet dimness, letting the caffeine sharpen my tactical focus. The execution of the extraction had been flawless. We were untraceable, secure, and hours ahead of Declan processing timeline. We boarded the aircraft exactly on schedule. The business class cabin was an oasis of calm efficiency. The flight attendants guided us to our pod seating, offering warm towels and adjusting the privacy dividers. I secured Leo into his lie-flat seat, fastening the heavy belt across his waist. He snuggled into the premium bedding, letting out a soft, contented sigh. I settled into the pod directly adjacent to him and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I needed to perform one final system check before the cabin doors closed. As the screen illuminated, the device vibrated violently in my hand. A notification flashed across the locked screen. It was a text message from Declan. I unlocked the phone and opened the message thread. His words were dripping with the toxic, narcissistic arrogance that had defined our entire marriage. "Are your bags packed yet? You have exactly 1 hour to get back here and apologize. If you make a scene when you walk through the door, I am locking you out for the night. Do not test me." I stared at the glowing text. I read the words a second time, letting the absolute absurdity of his threat wash over me. He genuinely believed he possessed total control. He was sitting at that restaurant or perhaps drinking his expensive whiskey in the back of an executive town car, thoroughly convinced that I was currently sitting in the dark driveway, crying over my steering wheel, preparing to crawl back into his house and beg for his forgiveness. He thought his financial abuse had rendered me completely paralyzed. A genuine, completely unforced smile spread across my face. It was the first real smile I had experienced in years. The sheer hubris of his text message was the perfect closing chapter to his reign of terror. He was threatening me with a locked door, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just locked the door on his entire fraudulent existence. The flight attendant voice crackled over the intercom, instructing passengers to secure their devices and prepare for departure. The heavy cabin doors sealed shut with a definitive pressurized thud. I did not reply to Declan. I did not give him the satisfaction of reading a single word of my defiance. He did not deserve a farewell. Instead, I opened the encrypted communication application I had installed earlier. I pulled up the secure thread connected directly to Marcus Thorne, my lethal corporate attorney in Manhattan. The digital packet containing the forged loan documents, the falsified bank statements, and the horrific evidence of Leo's stolen identity was already sitting in Marcus' possession. He was just waiting for the green light. My thumbs moved across the keyboard with absolute freezing precision. I typed 3 simple words: execute the freeze. I hit send. The message delivered instantly. I immediately held down the power button on my smartphone, bypassed the standard shutdown sequence, and switched the device permanently into airplane mode. I removed the SIM card from the side slot, snapped it in half, and dropped the tiny pieces into my empty coffee cup. As the massive aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its slow, deliberate taxi toward the runway, the legal mechanism I had just triggered was already detonating across Declan Life. Marcus was not just filing a standard divorce petition. The command I sent initiated a catastrophic financial lockdown. Within minutes, federal fraud alerts would slam into every single joint bank account bearing Declan's name. The credit bureaus would instantly freeze his profiles. The aggressive freeze protocols Marcus utilized were designed for hostile corporate takeovers. They required zero judicial oversight to initiate. They acted as a digital guillotine, severing Declan access to every liquid asset, credit line, and margin account he possessed. The commercial lenders currently holding the fraudulent business loans would receive automated emergency notifications regarding identity theft, immediately halting any pending transfers and calling in his existing debts. By the time the sun rose tomorrow, he would not be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone pay the balloon loans that were currently keeping him out of federal prison. The plane turned onto the active runway. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the cabin floor and pressing me firmly back into the leather seat. The acceleration was rapid, raw, and relentless. We lifted off the tarmac, climbing steeply into the dark, rain-swept sky, breaking through the heavy cloud cover to reveal a brilliant expanse of stars. Down below, exactly when Declan thought his arrogant 1-hour ultimatum was expiring, the trap would finally snap shut. His platinum cards would decline, his bank accounts would lock. The false empire he had violently built using my name and my son identity was completely irreversibly burning to the ground. And we were flying to freedom. The descent into Switzerland was as smooth as glass. Below us, the jagged snow-capped peaks of the Alps pierced the early morning clouds, giving way to the pristine, dark blue expanse of Lake Geneva. As the wheels of the aircraft touched down on the tarmac, a profound physical weight lifted from my chest. We had made it. We navigated through the incredibly efficient Swiss customs without a single delay. The border agents barely glanced at our red passports before waving us through, welcoming us home. I secured a private car service, and within 30 minutes, we were pulling up to a quiet tree-lined street in the heart of Eau Vive. My mother apartment was exactly as I had maintained it in my memory. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into a sanctuary of minimalist sunlit perfection. The walls were painted a crisp, brilliant white. The furniture was sleek, functional, and completely devoid of the heavy, ostentatious velvet and dark mahogany that choked Declan's suburban mansion. There were no fake trophies of wealth here, only the quiet, authentic comfort of true security. Large French windows opened onto a wrought iron balcony overlooking the lake. The air inside smelled faintly of pine and clean linen, an absolute contrast to the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the life we had just left behind in America. Leo woke up as I set him down on the plush living room rug. He rubbed his eyes, looking around the bright, unfamiliar space. Instead of crying or asking for his father, he simply walked over to the floor to ceiling windows, mesmerized by the sailboats gliding across the distant water. I quickly unpacked his bag, setting up his favorite stuffed bear on the sofa to create an immediate sense of normalcy. He was safe. He was completely out of their reach. With my son quietly occupied, I retrieved my encrypted laptop from my travel bag and set it on the clear glass dining table. It was time to finalize the destruction. I connected to the secure, hardwired internet line I had maintained for this exact property and booted up the specialized video conferencing software Marcus had provided. The connection encrypted immediately. 3 faces appeared on my screen. Marcus Thorne sat in his Manhattan office looking impeccably sharp and ruthlessly awake, despite the time difference. Beside his video feed were 2 additional frames. One showed a stern, silver-haired man sitting in a stark, windowless conference room, identified on the screen only as Special Agent Vance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The other frame held a sharp-eyed woman adjusting her glasses, representing the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. "The financial freeze is absolute," Gwen Marcus stated, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "The commercial lenders were notified 3 hours ago. The accounts are locked, the credit lines are suspended, and the margin calls are already auto-generating. Now we need the payload." I did not waste time with pleasantries. I typed a complex 64-character alphanumeric sequence into the secure chat box. "That is the master decryption key for the offshore vault I populated last night," I informed the federal agents. "Inside, you will find high-resolution scans of a physical ledger Declan kept hidden in his biometric safe. It contains irrefutable proof of commercial identity theft, federal wire fraud, and the exploitation of a minor's social security number." I watched the reflections on their glasses as the agents accessed the files in real time. The silence stretching across the encrypted connection was heavy and lethal. They were looking at the forged signatures, the illicit routing numbers, and the staggering amounts of money illegally funneled into Beatrice and Richard's personal accounts. "This is incredibly thorough work," Agent Vance finally said, his professional stoicism cracking just enough to reveal genuine impressed shock. "The paper trail is completely mapped. He used your consulting firm tax identification to bypass commercial lending limits, and his mother acted as the shadow guarantor. And they failed to report any of these diverted funds as income." The IRS agent added, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "This is textbook tax evasion and money laundering. We are looking at decades of federal violations across multiple jurisdictions." "I need your verbal confirmation on the record," Marcus interrupted, expertly steering the conversation to protect his client. Gwendolyn Privacy Consulting LLC was completely hijacked. My client had zero knowledge of these transactions until she discovered the ledger. She is turning over this evidence voluntarily and comprehensively. Agent Vance nodded sharply. "We have the data, and we have the routing logs proving the funds never touched her personal accounts. Gwendolyn, you are officially classified as a cooperating witness. You and your son are fully granted federal whistleblower protection. You are completely immunized from the impending fallout. We have enough here to secure federal warrants by sunrise." I thanked them, my voice perfectly steady, and terminated the connection. The screen went black. The digital drop was complete. Declan was no longer just a terrible husband or a failing real estate broker. He was now the primary target of a massive federal criminal investigation. I closed the laptop and pushed it to the center of the glass table. I walked into the spotless kitchen, brewed a rich cup of espresso, and warmed up some milk for Leo. I found a fresh, flaky croissant I had grabbed from a bakery near the airport and plated it for my son. I carried our breakfast out onto the wrought iron balcony. The Swiss morning air was crisp and invigorating. The distant bells of the St. Pierre Cathedral chimed, echoing beautifully across the lake. I handed Leo his warm milk, and he smiled up at me, his eyes bright and completely free of fear. I took a slow, deep sip of my espresso, letting the profound peace of the moment wash over my entire body. I glanced at the silver watch on my wrist. It was late morning in Geneva, which meant the sun was just beginning to rise on the east coast of the United States. Declan would be waking up right now. He would reach for his phone expecting to see a frantic, apologetic text from me begging to come home. Instead, he would find his banking apps entirely frozen. He would find his credit cards instantly declining. And very soon he would hear the heavy, definitive knock of federal agents at his front door. He had demanded I pack my bags. He had demanded I leave. Now, sitting in the absolute tranquility of my Swiss sanctuary, I smiled at the rising sun, knowing I had given him exactly what he asked for. While I savored the crisp morning air and the taste of fresh espresso on my Swiss balcony, a vastly different reality was violently colliding with my husband across the Atlantic. I did not need to be standing in our Connecticut foyer to know exactly how the sequence of events was playing out. I had mapped his psychological profile as thoroughly as I had mapped his financial crimes, and his reaction was as predictable as the algorithms I used to dismantle him. Declan steered his leased Porsche Cayenne into the driveway just after sunrise, the tires crunching loudly over the pristine gravel. He had likely spent the entire night nursing his bruised ego at a luxury downtown hotel, or sleeping off his anger on the leather sofa in his broker's office, stewing in a toxic mixture of cheap scotch and unearned arrogance. He killed the engine and marched up to the grand front entrance, fully anticipating a scene of desperate contrition. He expected to unlock the door and find me pacing the hardwood floors, tear-stained and hyperventilating, ready to grovel for his forgiveness. He expected a total, unconditional capitulation. Instead, he was greeted by an absolute echoing vacuum of silence. He stepped into the foyer, dropping his keys onto the marble console with a sharp clatter. He called out my name, his voice laced with impatient condescension, demanding I present myself. There was no reply. The house was cold, the morning light casting long, empty shadows across the immaculate living room. He walked toward the kitchen, expecting to find me brewing his morning coffee or preparing breakfast for Leo, but the granite countertops were spotless and unused. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He assumed I was upstairs sulking in the master suite, playing a pathetic game of hide-and-seek to stretch out the drama of our argument. He climbed the sweeping staircase, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the oak treads, and pushed open the bedroom door. He announced that the silent treatment was over, striding past the perfectly made bed, and yanked open the double doors to my walk-in closet. The irritation on his face instantly melted into blank, uncomprehending shock. Half of the massive space was entirely stripped bare. My tailored suits, my travel bags, my secure briefcases, and my passport cash, everything was gone. Only a few discarded wire hangers remained swinging gently from the empty racks. A sudden sharp spike of adrenaline finally pierced his drunken hubris. He spun around and sprinted down the hall toward Leo's nursery. He threw the door open, his breathing suddenly shallow. The crib was empty. The mobile hung perfectly still above the mattress. Leo's favorite stuffed animals, his specialized travel stroller, and his thick fleece blanket had completely vanished. The room had the sterile, untouched atmosphere of a museum display. Panic flared, but Declan's narcissistic mind simply could not process a scenario where he was not the one holding all the leverage. He rushed back to the master suite and tore open the biometric safe hidden behind the floor-length mirror. He let out a massive sigh of relief when he saw the hollowed-out leather ledger exactly where he had left it. The physical book was still there, the brass padlock firmly in place. He had absolutely no idea that the ink and paper were now useless, already digitized, and sitting on federal servers. Convinced his financial secrets were safe, his panic briefly morphed back into blinding, self-righteous rage. He pulled out his phone, his thumb jamming angrily against the screen, and fired off a barrage of demanding text messages, completely unaware that the device they were being sent to was already lying in pieces at the bottom of an airport trash can. When his calls went straight to an automated out-of-service message, he decided I had taken Leo to a local boutique hotel to teach him a lesson, a temporary temper tantrum that he could easily crush by starving me out. Refusing to sit in the silent house, Declan retreated to the one place where his fragile ego was always insulated. He drove straight to the Oak Brook Country Club. The club's private mahogany bar was his ultimate sanctuary, a place where he could surround himself with other arrogant brokers and complain about his allegedly hysterical, ungrateful wife. He claimed his usual stool, ordered a premium double bourbon despite the early hour, and immediately began venting to Richard and a few other sycophants who had gathered for an early lunch. He spun a pathetic narrative painting himself as the long-suffering provider dealing with an emotionally unstable spouse who had packed her bags in a childish fit. He laughed loudly, downing his expensive liquor, assuring his audience that I would be crawling back the second my credit cards were cut off. When the bartender discreetly placed the leather check presenter on the polished wood counter, Declan didn't even look at the total. He casually reached into his designer wallet, pulled out his heavy metal black card, and tossed it onto the tray with a practiced theatrical flick of his wrist. He continued his boisterous storytelling, completely ignoring the bartender who had walked over to the point-of-sale terminal. A minute passed. Then 2. The bartender returned, clearing his throat nervously, holding the metal card suspended between 2 fingers. "I apologize, Mr. Declan," the bartender murmured, leaning in to keep his voice respectfully low. "The card is declining. It is..." Declan paused mid-sentence, a flush of embarrassed heat creeping up his neck. His friends stopped laughing. The heavy silence in the bar was deafening. "That is impossible," Declan snapped, snatching the card back. "It is a practically limitless account. Run it again. You must have keyed it in wrong." "I ran it 3 times, sir. The system is returning a hard decline code." Furious and now acutely aware of the stares from his colleagues, Declan pulled out his platinum business card. "Fine, use the corporate account. Your machine is clearly malfunctioning." The bartender swiped the second card. The machine let out a sharp negative beep. "Declined again, sir?" The humiliation was absolute and instantaneous. Richard had to silently pull out his own wallet to cover the tab, throwing a questioning, suspicious glance at Declan. The illusion of the untouchable real estate magnate shattered right there on the mahogany bar. Declan muttered a string of curses, grabbed his keys, and bolted out the heavy glass doors into the parking lot. Standing alone beside his leased SUV, the true suffocating weight of the situation finally began to set in. He pulled out his smartphone, his hands now visibly trembling, and opened his primary banking application. The biometric scanner read his face, and the screen transitioned to his dashboard. He expected to see a minor fraud alert, a simple banking error he could resolve with a quick, aggressive phone call. Instead, the screen was flooded with stark, glowing red banners. Account frozen. He swiped frantically to his business lines of credit. Account frozen. Suspicious, fraudulent activity. He navigated to the high-yield offshore accounts he had secretly established using my business entity. Account seized. Pending federal investigation. His breath hitched in his throat. The digital numbers that usually displayed his stolen millions had been replaced by a wall of terrifying legal warnings. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped his chest. He dialed the Platinum Concierge hotline for his primary financial institution, bypassing the automated menus by repeatedly pressing 0. "This is Declan," he shouted into the receiver the moment a representative answered. "My entire portfolio is locked. I need this lifted immediately. Do you know who I am?" "One moment, sir," the representative replied, her voice stripped of the usual sycophantic warmth. The line clicked, routing him to a different department. When the next voice came on the line, it was not a customer service agent. It was a severe clinical fraud investigator. "Sir, we cannot assist you," the investigator stated mechanically. "Your accounts have been subjected to a hard federal freeze initiated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division." All assets are currently locked under suspicion of wire fraud and commercial identity theft. We are legally prohibited from discussing this matter further. You need to contact legal counsel immediately." The line went dead. Declan stood completely paralyzed in the country club parking lot. The phone slipped from his sweat-slicked fingers and clattered onto the asphalt. The massive, inescapable reality of the trap I had built finally eclipsed his arrogance. He had no money, he had no wife, he had no son, and the flashing red banners on his shattered screen were just the opening volley of a complete absolute destruction. Declan scrambled to snatch his shattered smartphone from the rough asphalt of the parking lot. The screen was heavily spiderwebbed, but the touch sensors remained minimally responsive. His initial wave of paralyzing terror rapidly transmuted into a cornered, animalistic rage. Operating purely on blind adrenaline and unearned entitlement, he opened our family group chat. Sitting in my sunlit Geneva apartment, I watched the notifications hit my heavily encrypted relay server. The messages populated on my laptop screen in rapid, frantic succession. He began with demands. He ordered me to turn the car around, completely oblivious to the fact that an ocean already separated us. When 10 minutes passed with no reply, the demands morphed into vicious, unhinged threats. He called me hysterical. He called me delusional. He typed in furious capital letters declaring that he was driving straight to the police station. He threatened to file international kidnapping charges, promising that I would spend the rest of my natural life rotting in a federal penitentiary while he took sole custody of Leo. Madison quickly joined the digital fray. She sent a barrage of texts demanding I stop this childish tantrum and bring her nephew back immediately. Beatrice followed suit, flooding the chat with shrill, demanding voice notes that vibrated through my laptop speakers. She ordered me to fix Declan accounts this instant before she called her own attorneys to ruin me. They were a pack of wolves barking at the moon, entirely convinced that volume and aggression could somehow override reality. I did not type a single character in response. I did not engage. I did not defend myself. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, sipping my espresso, and allowed them to scream into the void. Their threats were pathetic, built on a foundation of authority they no longer possessed. As Declan typed his fifth threat to involve law enforcement, my attorney executed the countermeasure. Marcus Thorne did not send a text. He delivered a certified high-priority legal dossier directly to Declan inbox, copying Beatrice, Richard, and Madison. I watched the read receipts trigger in real time on my monitoring dashboard. The family group chat abruptly went dead silent. Marcus' legal notice was a masterpiece of corporate aggression. He bluntly informed the family that my departure was a completely lawful, permanent relocation of a dual citizen returning to her home country. There were no court orders, no custody arrangements, and no legal barriers preventing me from traveling with my son. Marcus made it crystal clear that international kidnapping charges were a complete legal impossibility, but the true lethal force of the email lay in the second paragraph. Marcus coldly outlined the exact federal statutes the family had violated. He listed the commercial identity theft, the wire fraud, the falsification of business records, and the unauthorized use of a minor's social security number. He formally notified them that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division were already in possession of the fully unencrypted master ledger. Marcus ended the communication with a brilliant, paralyzing warning. He advised Declan that any attempt to contact local law enforcement to report a missing person or a stolen child would only expedite his own arrest. The local authorities would instantly run his name, see the massive federal flags attached to his identity, and detain him on the spot. Declan was trapped in a cage of his own making. He could not call the police for help because the police were the exact people preparing to lock him away. The digital silence from the family was deafening. I knew exactly what was happening. They were staring at their screens, the blood draining from their faces, realizing the true magnitude of the avalanche hurtling toward them. And the avalanche was moving fast. The financial contagion I had unleashed did not remain contained to Declan personal accounts. The aggressive freeze protocols ripped through their entire synchronized Ponzi scheme within hours. Across town, Beatrice was attempting to soothe her nerves with a mid-morning shopping trip at an exclusive designer boutique. I monitored the financial telemetry data from my laptop. The merchant attempted to process a $5,000 transaction on her primary platinum card. The system returned a hard, instantaneous decline. Beatrice, likely blaming a simple bank error, handed over a second card. Declined. She tried a third. Declined. Every single commercial line of credit she had illegally tethered to my business entity was dead. The accounts were not just frozen, they were flagged for active fraud. She was forced to leave her luxury purchases on the counter and walk out of the boutique empty-handed. Richard fared no better. The automated clearinghouse payment for his exorbitant country club membership dues triggered a catastrophic bounce. The club management, possessing zero tolerance for delinquent accounts, instantly suspended his privileges. He was locked out of the golf course, the dining room, and the private lounges he used to project his fake wealth. But the most satisfying tactical strike came from the vehicle telemetry network. The fleet of luxury SUVs Beatrice and Declan drove were all leased under the hijacked credentials of my consulting firm. The moment Marcus filed the commercial identity theft affidavits with the lending institutions, the auto financiers activated the remote GPS immobilizers. Declan was still standing in the country club parking lot when the signal hit. He climbed into his leased Porsche, desperately needing to drive to his mother house to plan a defense, and pressed the ignition button. The engine did not turn over. The dashboard screen simply flashed a stark, unyielding message instructing him to contact his leasing agent immediately. The vehicle was electronically bricked. It was completely useless, flagged for immediate repossession. A heavy-duty tow truck was likely already dispatched to drag the vehicle away in front of his elite country club peers. Their entire reality was disintegrating in real time. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, and the sprawling estates were all evaporating into thin air. They were utterly bankrupt, exposed to federal prosecution, and stripped of the stolen credit that had funded their arrogance. I closed the monitoring dashboard on my laptop and turned my attention back to the stunning view of Lake Geneva. The water sparkled brilliantly under the midday sun. Leo was sitting happily on the rug behind me, assembling a tower of brightly colored wooden blocks. The toxic chaos unfolding across the Atlantic felt like a lifetime away. I had dismantled their fraudulent empire without ever raising my voice. I had protected my son, secured my assets, and reclaimed my life. The storm was currently tearing through their world, but inside my Swiss sanctuary, there was nothing but perfect, unbreakable peace. The shockwave of the federal freeze did not remain contained to the parking lot of the Oakbrook Country Club. It violently rippled outward, crashing into the manicured suburban existence of Declan's sister Madison and her husband Terrence. Terrence was a man of meticulous, unyielding order. As an African-American senior auditor for one of the world's most prominent global accounting firms, his entire career was built on a foundation of unassailable integrity. He spent his days identifying anomalies, sniffing out inconsistencies, and exposing financial rot inside Fortune 500 companies. He possessed an inherent razor-sharp intuition for when numbers stopped making sense, and the numbers in his own life had just started bleeding. It began with subtle yet distinct domestic disruptions. Madison's smartphone began vibrating endlessly during their quiet Saturday morning breakfast. She paced the kitchen island, her face pale, her voice reduced to a frantic, hushed whisper as she fielded panicked calls from her mother Beatrice and her brother. Terrence watched her over the rim of his coffee mug, his analytical mind quietly cataloging the data points. He noticed the sudden erratic shifts in Madison's behavior. There was the abrupt cancellation of her weekly luxury spa appointments, the nervous, obsessive checking of the mail, and the uncharacteristic snapping at their housekeeper over trivial grocery expenses. When Madison abruptly claimed she needed to drive to her parents' estate for a sudden family emergency, and returned 4 hours later looking physically ill and smelling faintly of cheap gin, Terrence's professional instincts shifted into high alert. The atmosphere in their home reeked of a catastrophic liquidity crisis. Terrence did not ask questions. He knew better than to interrogate a panicked, defensive target. Instead, he waited. He waited until Sunday evening when Madison took a heavy sedative and went to bed early, citing a debilitating migraine. Once the house was dead silent, Terrence retreated to his home office, locked the heavy mahogany doors, and booted up his encrypted corporate laptop. He began a quiet, surgical, and ruthless audit of his own household. He pulled their joint tax returns, initiated deep pulls of their credit reports, and ran algorithms across their banking statements. For the first 3 hours, the domestic ledger appeared perfectly balanced. But Terrence was a senior auditor. He did not just look at the surface. He dug into the metadata of their recent property, refinancing an endeavor Madison had aggressively insisted on handling herself to take something off his plate. He bypassed the standard consumer portals and pulled the raw digital escrow files directly from the county registry. That was when the bottom fell out of his world. Buried beneath layers of convoluted LLC transfers, shell companies, and dummy corporate accounts was a massive high-interest commercial loan originated 8 months prior. The loan was tied directly to Beatrice and Richard's heavily leveraged estate, acting as a secret secondary line of credit to keep their sinking, ostentatious lifestyle afloat. But it was the guarantor's signature block on page 42 of the digital contract that made the blood freeze in Terrence's veins. Their executed in flawless digital ink was his own signature. Terrence stared at the glowing screen, his mind processing the betrayal with terrifying, icy clarity. Madison had forged his name. She had weaponized his pristine Tier 1 credit score and his unblemished professional reputation to co-sign a fraudulent, toxic loan for her parents. She had permanently anchored Terrence to their impending financial ruin, using a corrupt notary she went to college with to bypass the standard identity verification protocols. He cross-referenced the dates and the routing numbers. The loan had just triggered a catastrophic default notice due to the federal freeze I had initiated. The bank was launching secondary collections. They were coming for him. The rage that ignited within Terrence was cold, absolute, and entirely devoid of emotional hysteria. His wife had not just lied to him. She had actively conspired to commit felony wire fraud and identity theft against him. She had treated his hard-earned financial stability and his professional license as acceptable collateral damage to protect her family's grotesque vanity. Terrence did not storm into the master bedroom. He did not wake Madison and demand a tearful explanation. He operated exactly like the federal investigators currently dismantling Declan's life, silently, systematically, and with lethal precision. He secured his own assets immediately. He transferred his liquid capital into a newly established, isolated account, locked down his credit with the 3 major bureaus, and flagged the fraudulent loan as severe identity theft directly with the lender, initiating an internal fraud investigation against his own wife. Then he looked at the broader strategic picture. He knew about Declan's sudden spectacular meltdown. He knew I had vanished into thin air. Connecting the dots took him less than 3 minutes. He understood exactly what I had done, and he respected the flawless execution of the exit. Terrence opened a secure encrypted communication channel using a virtual private network, routing his signal through the dark web servers he typically utilized for highly classified corporate whistleblowing. He sent a single heavily encrypted email to the secure address I had maintained for my private consulting clients. I found the structural weakness. He typed, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Madison forged my signature on the secondary credit lines. I have the internal routing numbers, the IP addresses, and the notary logs proving the conspiracy. Within 15 minutes, my encrypted chat client chimed in Geneva. Terrence did not mince words, and he did not ask for sympathy. He transmitted the massive, high-resolution PDF files of the internal bank statements, the forged guarantor documents, and the digital paper trail proving Madison's direct, undeniable involvement in the federal wire fraud. He provided the final missing piece of the puzzle, handing me the exact, irrefutable ammunition needed to ensure that Madison would be swept up in the exact same federal indictments targeting Declan, Beatrice, and Richard. They used us both. Terrence typed, his keystrokes deliberate and heavy with finality. I am submitting these files to the SEC and my own legal counsel in the morning. I am building my own exit strategy. Burn them to the ground. Consider it done. My reply flashed back instantly. Terrence closed the laptop, the screen going black, and sat in the dark office ready to watch his marriage and his in-laws disintegrate into ash. While Terrence finalized his exit strategy in the dark, the rest of the family was frantically scrambling for a lifeline. The federal freeze had completely choked their cash flow. Declan's accounts were seized, Beatrice's credit lines were dead, and Richard was locked out of his own assets. Desperation breeds delusion. With their traditional avenues of financial survival completely cut off, Madison and Beatrice turned to the court of public opinion. They needed untraceable cash, and they needed a convenient scapegoat. The very next morning, a digital alert pinged on my encrypted server. It was a link to a newly minted crowdfunding page. The banner image was a heavily edited, perfectly lit photograph of Declan holding Leo at a country club brunch months ago, looking like the epitome of fatherly devotion. The bold, glaring text across the top read, "Bring baby Leo home." I clicked the link and read the campaign description, marveling at the sheer audacity of their lies. Madison had clearly penned the narrative, utilizing her best manipulative corporate marketing tone to craft a masterpiece of fiction. The page detailed a tragic, entirely fabricated story of a loving father fighting to rescue his infant son from a catastrophic situation. The financial goal was set at a staggering $250,000, ostensibly to fund an international legal team, private investigators, and travel expenses to track us down. They painted a picture of absolute unmerited devastation, conveniently omitting the reality of federal warrants, seized assets, and commercial identity theft. Instead, the narrative focused exclusively and viciously on me. I was no longer the successful privacy consultant who had unknowingly funded their lavish lifestyle. In their twisted revisionist history, I was an unemployed, severely unstable woman who had suffered a massive, terrifying psychological break. They claimed my sudden departure was a manic episode, a violent abduction that left their perfect family entirely shattered. Beatrice had immediately mobilized her extensive network of high society housewives, sharing the link across every social media platform with frantic, tearful pleas for help. The campaign gained traction with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, the local Connecticut media had picked up the scent of suburban tragedy. Beatrice leveraged her remaining social capital to secure a prime-time segment on the regional evening news. Sitting at my glass dining table in Geneva, I watched the live broadcast stream on my laptop. The screen showed Beatrice and Madison sitting shoulder to shoulder on a plush studio couch in the local news station, dabbing their perfectly dry eyes with tissues. The anchor delivered the story with grave, dramatic tones, repeating every piece of their slander word for word. They broadcasted claims that I had a hidden history of mental instability, that I was a danger to myself and my infant son, and that my complete disappearance without a trace was irrefutable proof of my psychological unraveling. Madison looked directly into the camera and pleaded for the public to help her brother navigate this living nightmare. They showed B-roll footage of our empty house, weaponizing the bare master closet and the stripped nursery as chilling evidence of my erratic, unhinged behavior. Not once did the reporter mention the frozen bank accounts. Not once did they question why a supposedly wealthy real estate broker needed to crowdsource his legal fees. It was a flawlessly orchestrated, completely fraudulent smear campaign designed to completely destroy my reputation and generate a massive influx of emergency cash to fight the invisible war they were currently losing. The wealthy suburban community swallowed the lie whole. Outraged neighbors, former colleagues, and country club acquaintances rallied behind the supposedly grieving father. The PTA mothers and the local country club members shared the broadcast link relentlessly. The crowdfunding totals skyrocketed by the hour, pulling in tens of thousands of dollars from sympathetic strangers and friends who fully believed they were funding a righteous crusade to save a kidnapped child. The comments section of the page was a cesspool of vitriol directed at me, filled with people demanding I be locked away in a psychiatric ward the moment I was found and brought to justice. Then came the crowning performance of the broadcast. The camera cut to Declan. He was standing on the front lawn of our Connecticut home looking appropriately disheveled. He wore a slightly wrinkled sweater, his hair deliberately unstyled, playing the role of the devastated, exhausted patriarch to absolute perfection. He stared directly into the camera lens, forcing a single glistening tear to track down his cheek. He spoke in a hoarse, trembling voice, begging me to come to my senses and bring his boy back. He talked about how much he loved me, how he just wanted to get me the medical help I so desperately needed, and how he would forgive absolutely everything if I just came home safely with Leo. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. He played the victim with such total, unwavering conviction that anyone who did not know the truth would have wept for him on the spot. He painted himself as a martyr, a man standing strong and full of grace in the face of his wife's tragic mental collapse. I watched the donation counter on the adjacent tab tick higher and higher, fueled directly by his televised crocodile tears. He was using his own son's absence to scam his friends and neighbors, crowdsourcing a legal defense fund for the federal crimes he was about to be indicted for. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he had outsmarted the system by changing the narrative and turning the entire state of Connecticut against me, creating a public shield of sympathy to hide behind. I took a slow sip of my espresso, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. Declan was putting on the performance of a lifetime on regional television, entirely unaware that federal agents were already monitoring his every public statement, documenting this new stream of fraudulent income, and preparing to drop the final crushing hammer on his televised pity party. I set my empty espresso cup down on the glass table. The time for passive observation was over. I opened the secure encrypted channel to Marcus Thorne in New York. I typed a single definitive command: execute the countermeasure. Marcus had been waiting for my authorization. Within 10 minutes, his firm's elite public relations division dispatched a comprehensive, heavily vetted press release to every major news outlet in Connecticut, including the specific regional station that had just broadcast Declan's tearful charade. We did not send a desperate plea for sympathy. We sent a weaponized dossier of undeniable facts. The communication was delivered directly from Thorne and Associates, a Manhattan law firm renowned for utterly destroying opponents in high-stakes corporate litigation. The opening paragraph stated unequivocally that Gwendolyn Privacy Consulting, LLC, and its founder were taking immediate legal action against the defamatory, entirely fabricated claims broadcast on network television. The subject line was sterile, authoritative, and designed to make station executives and legal departments sit up in a cold sweat. The press release methodically dismantled Declan's entire narrative piece by piece. It began by addressing the kidnapping allegations with blunt force. Marcus provided redacted but verifiable copies of flight manifests and border entry logs, proving my departure was a completely transparent, commercially booked flight. He cited international and federal family law, clarifying that as a dual citizen with absolutely no pending divorce filings, no custody orders, and no legal restrictions of any kind, my relocation to Switzerland with my son was entirely lawful. I was not a fugitive. I was a mother legally returning to her home country of citizenship. Next, Marcus targeted the slander regarding my mental state and supposed financial dependency. Declan had painted me as a helpless, unstable, unemployed housewife prone to manic episodes. The press release shattered that illusion with brutal, unyielding efficiency. It formally introduced me to the public as the sole founder and chief executive officer of a highly lucrative, internationally recognized data security firm. Marcus included verified summaries of my corporate filings, demonstrating that I was a high net worth individual and the primary financial provider for our household. The narrative of a delusional dependent woman abruptly vanished instantly, replaced by the intimidating reality of a highly calculated, legally protected corporate executive. To seal the trap, Marcus addressed the crowdfunding campaign directly. He publicly cautioned the community that the funds being aggressively solicited were not for a missing child investigation. He stated that the money was being gathered under false pretenses by an individual currently experiencing severe, undisclosed financial distress. He did not explicitly mention the active federal investigation, but he planted a massive seed of suspicion. He challenged the media to verify Declan's claims of wealth, daring them to look into why a supposedly successful real estate mogul was begging his suburban neighbors for loose change. The shift in the public sphere was instantaneous and violently aggressive. The regional news station, suddenly terrified of a massive defamation lawsuit from a top-tier Manhattan firm, abruptly pulled Declan's interview from their digital platforms and streaming services. In its place, they aired a breaking news update reading Marcus's statement word for word during the primetime evening broadcast. The anchors, previously dripping with sympathy for the weeping father, now stared into the camera with grim journalistic skepticism. They displayed graphics of my company logo and read quotes from the legal dossier, effectively turning the broadcast into a total vindication of my departure. The community backlash was remarkably swift. The same country club acquaintances and suburban neighbors who had shared Declan's fundraising link just hours earlier began deleting their posts in an embarrassed panic. The comments section on the campaign page transformed into a digital war zone. Donors began demanding their money back, tagging the platform's fraud department and asking pointed, hostile questions. If she is a millionaire CEO, why did you say she was unemployed? If there is no court order, why are you claiming your son was kidnapped? Within an hour of the press release hitting the wires, the platform's trust and safety team suspended the campaign entirely. The donation counter was locked, and the funds were frozen. Declan's desperate emergency cash grab was neutralized before a single dollar could be transferred to his empty bank accounts. Local journalists, sensing blood in the water, pivoted their focus with ruthless curiosity. They stopped looking for a missing mother and started digging intensely into the allegedly grieving father. Investigative reporters began pulling public records. They accessed the county property registries and discovered the bizarre, highly leveraged loan structures Beatrice and Madison had recently set up. They pulled commercial real estate data and noticed that Declan's brokerage had not closed a legitimate high-value deal in over a year. Whispers began circulating through the local financial sector. A vendor at the country club leaked the story of Declan's violently declined black card. A paralegal at a local firm mentioned rumors of sudden, inexplicable liquidity issues regarding Richard's suspended club memberships. The reporters started making calls connecting the dots of unpaid invoices, bounced checks, and sudden asset freezes. The public shield of sympathy Declan had tried to hide behind was instantly converted into a harsh, unforgiving magnifying glass. He had invited the media to look closely at our lives arrogantly, assuming he could control exactly what they saw. Instead, he had shone a blinding spotlight directly onto his own crumbling facade. His phone, already flooded with automated alerts about frozen accounts and suspended credit lines, now began ringing endlessly, with calls from aggressive investigative reporters demanding comments on his financial discrepancies and his fraudulent charity campaign. I sat in my spotless Swiss apartment watching the digital tide turn with absolute mathematical precision. Declan had wanted a public spectacle. He had wanted an audience to validate his ego and fund his survival. Now he had the undivided attention of the entire state, and they were watching him fall apart in real time. Sitting in Geneva, I watched the digital dominoes fall exactly as Terence had promised. While Marcus Thorne's press release was systematically poisoning Declan's public narrative, Terence was quietly executing the final phase of his own clinical extraction. The crowdfunding campaign still represented a dangerous, active revenue stream for their fraudulent defense. Madison and Beatrice had managed to siphon tens of thousands of dollars in pledges from gullible suburbanites before the truth began to circulate. They desperately needed that capital to mount a legal defense against the impending federal charges. Terence made absolutely certain they would never touch a single dime. I monitored the back-end analytics as the strike occurred. Terence did not use the standard reporting button on the website. As a senior auditor for a Tier 1 accounting firm, he possessed direct contacts within the corporate compliance departments of major financial institutions. He bypassed the automated customer service queue and routed his communication directly to the crowdfunding platform's executive risk management team. He drafted a formal, chillingly precise compliance notice. He identified the campaign as an active vehicle for felony wire fraud. He attached the forged loan documents, the metadata proving Madison's IP address had originated the fraudulent signatures, and a digital copy of the legal dossier detailing the active federal investigation into Declan and Beatrice. Terrence explicitly invoked federal anti-money laundering statutes, warning the platform that allowing the campaign to process the funds would render the corporation legally complicit in a synchronized financial crime. The corporate reaction was instantaneous and absolute. The platform's legal department did not merely pause the campaign, they initiated a total, unrecoverable purge. I watched the campaign page refresh on my browser, only to be replaced by a stark permanent error code. Every single transaction was flagged for severe compliance violations. Automated protocols immediately reversed the charges, forcibly refunding every donor to ensure the platform remained compliant with federal law. Across Connecticut, hundreds of smartphones pinged simultaneously. Country club members, PTA presidents, and sympathetic strangers received stark, automated emails notifying them that their donations had been fully refunded due to confirmed fraudulent activity. The public humiliation was total. The community realized instantly that they had been scammed by the very people pleading for their help. Terrence sent me a final, heavily encrypted message detailing the conclusion of his domestic audit. He recounted the confrontation with the objective clinical detachment of a man presenting a failed compliance report. Madison had walked through the front door of their pristine suburban home just after 6 o'clock that evening. She was still wearing the conservative, demure outfit she had carefully selected for the television broadcast. Her makeup was slightly smudged, a calculated touch to enhance her performance as the devastated, exhausted sister. She was riding the adrenaline high of her televised manipulation, completely oblivious to the fact that her digital safety net had just been evaporated and her financial crimes had been thoroughly documented. She found Terrence sitting at the massive marble kitchen island. The house was perfectly silent. There were no comforting words, no offers of support. Terrence was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, looking like a man prepared for litigation, not domestic comfort. Spread across the marble surface in precise, geometrically perfect alignment were 3 thick manila folders. "The campaign is dead," Terrence stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He did not look up. He was reviewing a final spreadsheet on his laptop. Madison froze, her designer purse slipping from her shoulder to hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. She attempted to feign ignorance, opening her mouth to launch into her practiced victim narrative, but Terrence cut her off with a single raised hand. "Do not insult my intelligence by lying," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were cold, analytical, and entirely unforgiving. "I am a senior auditor, Madison. My entire career is built on finding the discrepancies arrogant people try to hide. I found the secondary commercial loans, I found the shell companies, and I found the guarantor's signature block where you forged my name to secure a toxic, fraudulent line of credit for your parents." The blood drained from Madison's face, leaving her pale and trembling beneath her television makeup. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The arrogant, manipulative facade she had maintained for years instantly shattered, replaced by the sheer, paralyzing terror of a cornered criminal. Terrence calmly slid the first manila folder across the smooth marble. "These are divorce papers. They outline a total, non-negotiable dissolution of our marriage. You will not receive a single cent of my retirement accounts, my investments, or my equity. If you attempt to contest the division of assets, I will submit the second folder to the federal prosecutor currently building the indictment against your brother." He pushed the second folder forward. "This is a civil lawsuit for commercial identity theft and felony forgery. It contains the exact IP logs, the routing numbers, and the digital timestamps proving you weaponized my credit to fund your family's Ponzi scheme. I have already submitted this entire dossier to the crowdfunding platform's fraud department, which is why your little televised scam was permanently shut down 20 minutes ago. I have also submitted it to the Securities and Exchange Commission and my own corporate legal counsel. You are completely exposed." Madison sank into one of the leather bar stools, her hands covering her face as harsh, ragged sobs tore through her chest. This was not a television performance. This was the visceral reality of her entire existence collapsing. She tried to reach out to him, begging for a chance to explain, pleading that she only did it to help her parents survive a temporary cash flow issue. Terrence stood up, adjusting his cuffs with the meticulous precision of a man who had successfully concluded a highly complex operation. He looked down at the woman he had married, feeling nothing but a profound clinical disgust. "Your family is a sinking ship," Terrence said, his tone chillingly flat. "You built a life on fraudulent credit and arrogant entitlement. I am severing my liability. You have exactly 1 hour to pack whatever you can fit into a single suitcase and vacate my property. If you are still inside this house when the hour is up, I will call the police and have you arrested for identity theft." Terrence picked up his briefcase, turned his back on her sobbing form, and walked out the front door. He climbed into his waiting car and drove away into the cool evening, cleanly and permanently detaching himself from the toxic wreckage of her family. I closed the encrypted chat window in Geneva, pouring myself a glass of wine, ready to watch the final act unfold. The wine tasted like absolute victory. Across the Atlantic, the taste in Declan's mouth was nothing but ash and panic. The total collapse of his fraudulent GoFundMe campaign was the final definitive nail in his coffin. With Terrence's damning dossier now sitting on the desks of federal prosecutors and the SEC, the official indictments were rapidly shifting from a distant threat to an imminent reality. The family structure, once a unified front of arrogant entitlement, was violently fracturing into self-preserving splinters. Beatrice and Richard had barricaded themselves inside their sprawling estate, refusing to answer the door and screening all of Declan's frantic phone calls. Madison, freshly homeless, legally exposed, and utterly ruined, was entirely unreachable. Declan found himself completely isolated, stripped of his enablers, and entirely cut off from his stolen wealth. But a narcissist facing total annihilation does not experience clarity or remorse. They experience a blinding primal desperation. Traditional banking was a closed door. His credit profile was completely radioactive, flagged by federal agencies and frozen by every major financial institution. Without liquid capital, Declan could not hire defense attorneys, he could not run, and he could not fight. So he descended into the subterranean financial world he used to mock from the comfort of his country club lounges. Through a disgraced former contractor with ties to the criminal underworld, Declan made contact with a syndicate of predatory private lenders operating out of a windowless, heavily guarded warehouse in South Boston. These were not men who negotiated payment plans or sent strongly worded collections letters. They broke bones, seized physical assets by force, and operated entirely outside the confines of the law. Operating on pure, unadulterated hubris and blind panic, Declan sat across a folding table from violent men and lied through his teeth. He leveraged a completely fabricated commercial property portfolio using forged deeds to secure $50,000 in untraceable bundled cash. The interest rate was extortionate, the repayment window was suicidally short, and the implied threats of physical violence were explicitly clear. Declan did not care. He viewed the dirty money merely as a temporary bridge loan. He was fully intending to force me to pay it back once he reasserted his dominance and regained control of our lives. He immediately purchased a direct premium-class flight to Geneva. He was racing the clock, terrified his passport would be flagged and seized by federal authorities before he could clear international airspace. Sitting in his plush leather seat high over the Atlantic Ocean, downing scotch to steady his trembling hands, Declan convinced himself this was merely a temporary domestic dispute. His mind, utterly incapable of accepting defeat, spun a delusional narrative of victory. He actually believed he could simply walk into my sanctuary, physically intimidate me, grab our infant son, and order me to fix the massive legal avalanche hurtling toward his head. In his fractured, arrogant reality, I was still the quiet, submissive, easily manipulated wife who existed solely to absorb his stress and manage his messes. He expected tears. He expected apologies. He expected me to instantly crumble the moment he raised his voice, just as I had done 1,000 times before in our Connecticut home. He planned to drag me back to the United States, force me to retract the commercial identity theft affidavits, and make me tell the federal investigators that the entire situation was simply a massive clerical misunderstanding. He thought my intelligence was a fluke and my escape was a temporary manic episode that he could cure with a heavy hand. He landed at Geneva Airport running on stale alcohol, jet lag, and raw explosive aggression. Using a portion of his borrowed untraceable cash, he had retained a sleazy local private investigator the day prior. He had provided the investigator with the Swiss corporate registration details of my data security firm to track down my exact residential address. The text message containing my location pinged on his phone exactly as he cleared Swiss customs. He did not bother checking into a hotel or dropping off his luggage. He hailed a taxi, gripping the leather handle of his duffel bag, his eyes bloodshot and fixed entirely on the ultimate prize of his own salvation. My apartment building was located in the highly affluent, ultra-secure Eau Vive district. It was a fortress of limestone and reinforced glass overlooking the pristine waters of Lake Geneva. Declan did not respect the quiet, understated elegance of the neighborhood. He tailgated a floral delivery courier through the main security vestibule, slipping past the concierge desk with the aggressive, entitled stride of a man who firmly believed the world owed him entry. He rode the elevator to the penthouse level, his breathing heavy, his jaw tight, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He stepped out into the pristine, soundproofed corridor and marched directly to my door. The pounding started immediately. It was not a knock. It was a violent, closed-fisted assault on the heavy, solid oak door that echoed like gunfire down the quiet, immaculate hallway. He began shouting my name, his voice a ragged, furious bark that vibrated through the floorboards. He ordered me to open the door this instant. He demanded that I pack Leo's bags immediately. He screamed that this childish, psychotic tantrum was over and that I was coming back to Connecticut to drop the charges and fix his bank accounts. He hit the wood again, kicking the baseboard with his heavy dress shoes, threatening to break the door right off its hinges if I did not submit to his authority. He was a cornered, sweating animal, absolutely certain that his familiar brand of brute force and high-volume intimidation would yield the exact same result it always had. The heavy oak door did not splinter. It did not break. Instead, the internal biometric lock disengaged with a soft melodic chime, and the thick barrier swung silently inward on perfectly oiled hinges. Declan stumbled forward, his own violent momentum instantly betraying him as the physical resistance vanished. He caught his balance in the threshold, his chest heaving, a sheen of frantic sweat coating his forehead. He fully expected to find me cowering in the center of the foyer, weeping into my hands, ready to beg for his forgiveness and submit to his demands. He anticipated the terrified, malleable woman he had spent a decade carefully molding into a state of quiet obedience. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I stood perfectly still in the center of the expansive, sunlit entryway, dressed in flawless silk loungewear, holding a fresh demi-tasse of espresso. My posture was relaxed, my expression a mask of absolute glacial indifference. I looked at the red-faced, panting man standing on my doorstep, clutching his cheap nylon duffel bag, and felt absolutely nothing but a profound clinical boredom. The contrast between my pristine Swiss sanctuary and his desperate, sweaty arrival was stark. His jaw dropped. The venomous, rehearsed tirade he had prepared during his transatlantic flight died instantly in his throat. He blinked, completely disoriented by the reality of my unbothered demeanor. This was not the script he had written in his head. Operating on sheer, arrogant muscle memory, he opened his mouth, raising a trembling, aggressive finger toward my face, preparing to launch into his standard cycle of high-volume verbal abuse. He took a heavy, imposing step over the threshold, intending to physically dominate the space and force his way into my home. He never completed the stride. From the deep shadows of the minimalist foyer, two figures stepped seamlessly into the bright hallway light, moving with synchronized predatory grace. They were not private security guards. They were fully uniformed, heavily armed officers of the Geneva Cantonal Police. They wore dark tactical gendarmerie uniforms, their hands resting instinctively on the grips of their holstered weapons. Their expressions were etched with the severe, unyielding discipline characteristic of Swiss law enforcement. They flanked me immediately, stepping in front of my body, to form an impenetrable physical wall of state-sanctioned authority between my space and his. Declan froze. His raised finger hovered midair, trembling violently as his bloodshot eyes darted from the armed officers to my calm face. The aggressive, roaring animal that had been kicking my baseboards seconds ago evaporated into thin air, instantly replaced by a hollow, terrified shell. The sudden suffocating realization that he had walked directly into a meticulously set trap crashed down upon his shoulders. He had crossed an ocean and spent his last borrowed dollars to intimidate an unemployed, unstable housewife, only to find himself completely outmaneuvered by a highly protected corporate executive on foreign soil. I reached over to the marble console table beside me and picked up a thick, legally bound dossier. The heavy parchment pages were stamped with the official raised seals of both the United States Federal Court and the Swiss judicial system. I held the document up, ensuring the bold black lettering caught the hallway lighting. It was a fully validated, internationally recognized order of protection. I did not need to raise my voice to shatter his reality. I spoke with crisp, devastating clarity, informing him that his own digital footprint had sealed his fate. The moment he had sent that barrage of unhinged, violent death threats in the family group chat on the day of my departure, my legal team had captured, categorized, and translated every single keystroke. We had submitted the digital transcripts along with his documented history of financial instability, the active federal warrants, and his erratic travel logs directly to a local Swiss magistrate. The authorities in Geneva do not view domestic threats as a trivial matter to be swept under the rug. They viewed Declan exactly as the evidence portrayed him, an active, documented, and highly volatile threat to my safety and the safety of a minor child residing within their borders. Declan's face drained of all color, taking on a sickly, ashen hue. He took a stumbling step backward into the corridor, dropping his duffel bag onto the carpet. He raised his hands, stammering out a pathetic, broken string of excuses. He told the officers it was a massive misunderstanding. He claimed I was his wife, that this was just a simple domestic dispute, a minor disagreement over a child. He begged them to look at his American passport, frantically trying to assert a privilege he no longer possessed. The Swiss officers did not care about his excuses. They did not care about his American passport or his fabricated victimhood. They operated with a swift, brutal efficiency that left absolutely no room for negotiation or manipulation. The moment Declan had violently kicked my door and shouted threats in a residential hallway, he had violated multiple local ordinances and breached a strict international protection order. The larger officer barked a sharp, guttural command in French. When Declan hesitated, foolishly attempting to argue his case rather than immediately comply, the officers moved. It was not a gentle apprehension. The takedown was a textbook display of aggressive compliance enforcement. The officers closed the distance in a fraction of a second. One grabbed Declan's extended, pleading arm, twisting it sharply behind his back, with enough specialized force to elicit a sharp, breathless cry of pain. The second officer seized him roughly by the collar of his wrinkled sweater, spinning him around and slamming him forcefully face first against the pristine limestone wall of the corridor. The impact echoed sharply down the hall, knocking the breath completely out of Declan's lungs and silencing his pathetic protests. He gasped, his cheek pressed hard and flat against the cold stone, as the heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The familiar metallic click of the restraints locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the definitive, undeniable sound of his absolute defeat. Declan writhed weakly against the wall, but the officers held him pinned, entirely impervious to his frantic struggles. He turned his head as far as the officer's iron grip would allow, his eyes locking onto mine. They were filled with a chaotic, pathetic mixture of disbelief, terror, and total helplessness. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. I did not gloat. I did not deliver a dramatic emotional monologue. I simply stood in the doorway of my beautiful home and watched as the authorities stripped him of his freedom and his remaining dignity. His attempt to hunt me down had ended exactly as I had orchestrated. The officers pulled him roughly from the wall, barking another command as they marched him toward the waiting elevator. His legs dragged slightly, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the immaculate floor as he was hauled away to a Swiss holding cell. I stepped back, the biometric lock chiming once more, and allowed the heavy oak door to swing shut, leaving Declan to face the darkness of a foreign prison entirely alone. The Swiss holding cell was exceptionally clean, brutally cold, and entirely devoid of sympathy. Declan spent exactly 48 hours within its sterile concrete walls before the cantonal authorities processed his administrative expulsion. There was no judicial hearing, no opportunity for his usual silver-tongued negotiations, and absolutely no sympathetic local judge to manipulate. The Geneva police simply handed him his personal effects, drove him directly to the tarmac in a heavily armored transport vehicle, and marched him onto a commercial airliner bound for New York. He was formally classified as a persona non grata, permanently banned from entering the Schengen area under threat of immediate imprisonment. He was wedged into a cramped middle seat in the economy cabin, squeezed between two strangers who ignored his foul, radiating hostility. His wrists still ached intensely from the heavy steel cuffs, but physical discomfort was entirely secondary to the raging toxic inferno of his bruised ego. He spent the entire 8-hour transatlantic flight staring blankly at the seat back in front of him, his mind rapidly calculating an aggressive legal defense. He seethed with a venomous, unyielding fury, violently rejecting the reality of his own failure. Geneva was a fluke, he convinced himself. It was a jurisdictional anomaly, orchestrated by a bitter, vindictive woman who had gotten lucky with a local magistrate. Once his boots hit American soil, the dynamic would instantly shift back in his favor. He operated on the delusional certainty that his Connecticut connections, his country club charm, and his family's resources would insulate him from whatever legal tantrum I had tried to throw. He assumed he could tap into the crowdfunding capital Madison had raised, hire a ruthless defense attorney from Manhattan, tie me up in endless family court litigation, and regain total control. In his mind, he was still Declan, a master of optics and manipulation. No one could touch him on his home turf. The heavy tires of the Boeing 777 slammed into the tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport, the reverse thrusters roaring as the aircraft rapidly decelerated. Declan unbuckled his seatbelt long before the chimes sounded, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the cabin and reassert his dominance over his environment. He shoved past the passengers in the narrow aisle, ignoring their irritated grumbles, snatching his cheap nylon duffel bag from the overhead compartment with aggressive force. He just needed to find a quiet terminal lounge, purchase a new prepaid phone, and call his mother. Beatrice would know exactly what to do. She would wire him emergency capital, and together they would spin the Swiss incident as a traumatic kidnapping recovery effort gone wrong. He marched down the jet bridge, the humid New York air hitting his face. The narrow, carpeted tunnel opened into the bright, sprawling expanse of Terminal 4. Declan adjusted his wrinkled sweater, rolling his shoulders back, preparing to project an aura of arrogant authority as he merged with the crowd of arriving passengers. He took exactly 3 steps into the main concourse before his path was abruptly and definitively blocked. They were not wearing tactical gear or shouting guttural commands like the Swiss authorities. They did not need to. 5 men and women in impeccably tailored dark business suits stood in a precise semicircular formation directly outside the arrival gate. Their posture was rigid, their expressions utterly devoid of emotion, and small coiled earpieces disappeared neatly into their collars. A sea of disembarking passengers instinctively parted around them, creating a wide, highly visible perimeter of dead space. Declan froze, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished terrazzo floor. The lead agent, a tall man with a silver buzz cut and a gaze that felt like a physical weight, stepped forward. He did not ask for identification. He already knew exactly who his target was. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, extracting a slim leather wallet and flipped it open with a sharp snap. The gold badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the harsh terminal lighting. The woman standing to his immediate right mirrored the action, displaying the formidable insignia of the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. Declan Thorne, the FBI agent, stated. His voice was not raised, but it carried the devastating, undeniable weight of the United States federal government. "You are under arrest." Declan opened his mouth, his mind scrambling for a slick, practiced evasion, ready to deploy the charm that had shielded him for years. But the IRS agent immediately cut him off, her voice slicing cleanly through the ambient noise of the busy terminal. She read the charges with the clinical, merciless precision of a perfectly executed autopsy. She cited multiple counts of felony wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated commercial identity theft, and severe multi-year tax evasion. She spoke the words loudly, clearly, and without a shred of hesitation. The public spectacle Declan had spent his entire life desperately trying to avoid was suddenly happening in the middle of one of the busiest international airports in the world. Hundreds of weary travelers stopped dead in their tracks. Cell phones were raised. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The arrogant, wealthy real estate mogul was entirely stripped of his carefully curated facade, reduced to a common criminal standing in a wrinkled sweater surrounded by his own luggage. Two agents flanked him instantly. The heavy, unyielding snap of federal handcuffs echoed sharply around his wrists, biting deeply into the skin that had just begun to heal from the Swiss restraints. He was aggressively spun around, his hands locked securely behind his back. There was no negotiation. There were no frantic phone calls to his mother to beg for a bailout. He was marched through the center of the terminal, surrounded by a federal escort leading him directly toward a waiting motorcade that would transport him to a secure holding facility. The illusion of his supremacy was finally permanently dead. While Declan was being shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle in New York, a perfectly synchronized, highly classified operation was unfolding 100 miles north in the affluent hills of Connecticut. The authorities had timed the strikes with devastating precision, ensuring that no member of the family could warn the others. Beatrice and Richard had chosen this exact evening to host their annual midsummer gala. It was a calculated, desperate public relations maneuver designed to project an image of untouchable stability. Whispers of their financial irregularities had been poisoning the country club air for days, and Beatrice firmly believed that if she poured enough vintage champagne and served enough imported caviar, the rumors would simply drown. They had invited 50 of the wealthiest, most influential members of their social circle. The sprawling driveway was lined with luxury vehicles. A string quartet played softly in the grand foyer, and the dining room was aglow with the light of crystal chandeliers. Beatrice was holding court near the fireplace, wearing a freshly purchased designer gown, laughing loudly, and spinning elaborate tales about her son's supposed business ventures in Europe. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy iron security gates at the bottom of their driveway did not open for a late-arriving guest. They were manually breached by a tactical entry unit. A convoy of 6 unmarked black armored SUVs sped up the winding manicured driveway, their tires tearing through the pristine landscaping. They bypassed the valet station, entirely slamming into park in a tight tactical formation directly in front of the marble portico. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI and IRS emblazoned in bright yellow lettering poured out of the vehicles. They did not knock. They did not wait for the butler to announce them. They breached the massive double doors with swift, overwhelming kinetic force. The raid flooded the grand foyer like a dark, unstoppable tide. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the sudden silence broken only by the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots on marble. 50 high society guests froze their champagne flutes, hovering midair, watching in absolute paralyzed horror as federal authorities swarmed the gilded sanctuary. The lead agent stepped directly into the center of the living room, holding a thick sheaf of paperwork. He called out Richard and Beatrice's names in a booming, authoritative voice that shattered the refined atmosphere. Beatrice dropped her crystal glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent sound that signaled the permanent end of her reign. She attempted to salvage the situation with sheer delusional arrogance. She stepped forward, her face flushed with indignant rage, demanding to know the meaning of this intrusion and threatening to have every agent fired by her powerful political connections. The lead agent did not even blink. He simply handed her the federal search and arrest warrants, stating loudly and clearly that they were being taken into custody for running a multi-million-dollar fraudulent loan scheme, wire fraud, and severe tax evasion. The physical dismantling of their fraudulent empire began immediately. Teams of forensic investigators bypassed the stunned party guests and systematically gutted the mansion. They flooded Richard's private study, bagging and tagging hard drive servers and encrypted laptops. They seized boxes of physical ledgers hidden in the wall safe. They moved through the master suite, confiscating high-value jewelry, luxury watches, and bearer bonds that Beatrice had hidden in her vanity. The humiliation was not confined to the interior. Outside, heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks navigated the crowded driveway. The guests watched through the towering bay windows as federal agents slapped seizure notices onto the windshields of Richard's vintage sports car and Beatrice's top-of-the-line luxury SUV. The very symbols of their unearned status were being physically dragged away into the night, repossessed by the government to pay for their crimes. Richard, the supposed patriarch and financial genius, completely collapsed. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fragile, terrified old man. He did not protest. He did not yell. He simply slumped into a leather chair, gasping for air as a medic was temporarily called to ensure he was not having a cardiac event before he was processed. When he was cleared, an agent ordered him to stand. The final walk was an agonizing, meticulously public execution of their social standing. Beatrice and Richard were handcuffed, the heavy metal biting into their wrists. They were not offered the dignity of a back exit. The agents marched them directly through the center of their own living room, right past their silent, wide-eyed friends and country club peers. The people who had worshipped their wealth just an hour prior now pressed themselves against the walls, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive couple. Beatrice kept her head down, her meticulously styled hair falling across her face to hide her tears, while Richard shuffled forward, a broken, ruined man. I sat at my glass desk in Geneva, watching the digital feeds explode. The federal authorities had tipped off the local media networks regarding the high-profile raid. Local news helicopters had been circling the airspace above the Connecticut estate, capturing the flashing lights, the seizure of the vehicles, and the ultimate perp walk in high-definition thermal imaging. Within 30 minutes, the story transitioned from local breaking news to national syndication. My tablet illuminated with constant push notifications from top-tier financial and news outlets. The headlines were universally damning, detailing the spectacular collapse of a wealthy real estate family exposed as common fraudsters. The networks displayed their official booking mugshots side by side. Beatrice's makeup was smeared, her eyes red and puffy, completely devoid of her usual haughty glamour. Richard stared blankly into the camera, looking utterly defeated. For a decade, Declan, Beatrice, and Madison had chased the spotlight. They had built an entire existence around being seen, envied, and discussed by the masses. They had craved fame and absolute recognition above all else. Now they finally had the undivided attention of the entire country. Their faces were broadcast into millions of living rooms, their names trending across every social platform, and their financial secrets laid bare for public consumption. They had achieved their ultimate goal of total public recognition, forever cemented in history, not as elite visionaries but as convicted, humiliated felons. The screens illuminating my office were still flashing with the thermal imaging of Richard and Beatrice's arrest when my encrypted secondary phone began to buzz. The caller ID displayed a scrambled proxy number, but I already knew who was on the other end. I accepted the call, leaning back into my leather chair. A sharp, heavy exhale transmitted through the speaker, followed by a low, steady voice. Terrence did not bother with formal greetings. He simply stated that the final decisive phase of his exit strategy had been flawlessly executed. While the FBI and the IRS were actively tearing the Thorne family's financial infrastructure down to the studs, freezing every trust fund investment portfolio and offshore shell company tied to Richard Beatrice and Declan Terrence's capital remained completely untouched. He had spent the last several months meticulously severing his assets from Madison's reach, employing a labyrinth of independent LLCs and ironclad legal firewalls. He had filed preemptive disclosures with the federal authorities, providing a pristine, heavily documented paper trail proving that his personal wealth was generated entirely through his own legitimate salary and investments, completely untainted by the family's widespread fraud. By the time the government hit the Connecticut estate, Terrence was legally and financially untouchable. He had secured a clean, absolute break. Madison, conversely, was facing a reality so brutal it bordered on poetic. With her parents in federal custody, her brother sitting in a holding cell, and her husband having legally vanished with all his assets, she was left entirely destitute. Terrence provided the devastating details with clinical precision. Madison had frantically attempted to access their joint accounts the moment the news of the raid broke, only to discover they held a balance of exactly zero. Desperate, she had pivoted to the crowdfunding campaign she had illicitly launched to finance Declan's European ambush. However, the platform's security algorithms, triggered by the national news of the federal indictments, had immediately suspended the campaign and locked the payouts. Her financial ruin was merely the prelude to her legal nightmare. In her arrogant haste to secure emergency capital prior to the raid, Madison had forged Terrence's signature on a series of aggressive high-interest secondary loan documents. She had assumed her usual immunity to consequences would protect her. Instead, federal investigators had already seized those documents from Richard's study. They had traced the digital footprints directly back to Madison's personal IP address. She was no longer just the spoiled daughter of disgraced fraudsters. She was an active primary target for the authorities facing imminent severe charges for wire fraud and felony forgery. Stripped of her black cards, her designer wardrobe locked behind federal crime scene tape, and her social circle instantly abandoning her to protect their own reputations, Madison was left with absolutely nothing. Terrence informed me that she had been forced to use the last of her cash to rent a room in a dilapidated hourly motel just off Interstate 95. The woman who had spent a decade mocking my wardrobe, demanding five-star accommodations, and viewing anyone outside her tax bracket as subhuman, was now sleeping on a sagging, stained mattress beneath a flickering neon sign waiting for the inevitable knock of federal agents at her cheap veneer door. A profound, heavy silence settled over the phone line as Terrence and I allowed the sheer magnitude of the situation to sink in. We did not gloat. There was no need for triumphant cheering or petty celebrations. We simply shared a quiet, deeply mutual sense of vindication. We were the outsiders. We were the people brought into the Thorne family to serve highly specific utilitarian purposes. I was intended to be Declan's compliant, wealthy accessory, a stepping stone for his ambition. Terrence was supposed to be Madison's blind, obedient bankroll existing solely to fund her extravagant delusions. They had severely underestimated both of us. We had not just survived their toxic parasitic ecosystem, we had actively outmaneuvered them, meticulously dismantling their control and protecting our own futures with ruthless efficiency. Terrence's voice sounded remarkably different over the secure line. The tight, anxious edge that had always characterized his speech during family gatherings was entirely gone. He sounded lighter, grounded, and intensely focused. He told me he had no intention of retreating into quiet obscurity. Navigating the treacherous waters of the Thorne family's finances and subsequently engineering his own flawless extraction had ignited a fierce new ambition. He was taking his secured capital and launching his own independent auditing and forensic accounting firm. He planned to specialize in untangling complex corporate fraud, exposing hidden liabilities, and executing high-net-worth asset protection. He had literally written the playbook on surviving a financial house of cards, identifying the microscopic fractures in Richard's fraudulent empire long before the government stepped in. Now, he was going to weaponize that unparalleled expertise, turning his grueling personal nightmare into a highly lucrative elite enterprise. He already had his first 3 corporate clients lined up, executives who had quietly witnessed his brilliant maneuvering and wanted that exact level of ruthless protection for their own assets. I smiled, looking out the panoramic window of my Swiss sanctuary. The sun was beginning to rise over the Alps, casting a brilliant golden light across the pristine lake. I told Terence that his new firm would be a massive success, and that his ability to see through the smoke and mirrors was his greatest asset. We wished each other well, a genuine exchange of respect between 2 veterans of the same silent war. We both knew our paths were unlikely to cross again. The tie that bound us was broken, the family that connected us was in ruins, and we were both moving forward into lives we fully controlled. I ended the call and set the encrypted device down on the cool glass desk. The Thorne family's reign of manipulation, theft, and psychological warfare was comprehensively, permanently destroyed. They were locked in cells and cheap motels, drowning in the consequences of their own boundless greed. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp morning air, poured myself a fresh espresso, and turned my back on the flashing screens. My new life had officially begun. 6 months evaporated into the quiet, steady rhythm of genuine peace. The biting, defensive winter air of that final morning had slowly transformed into the gentle, sunlit warmth of a vibrant Swiss summer. I sat at a small, wrought-iron table outside a bustling cafe perched directly on the cobblestone promenade overlooking Lake Geneva. The water stretched out before me, a brilliant, vast expanse of sapphire blue, dotted with the white sails of leisure boats, slicing silently through the gentle breeze. I took a slow sip of a perfectly brewed cappuccino, the porcelain cup warm against my palms, and allowed my gaze to drift toward the adjacent Parc de la Grange. Leo was entirely unrecognizable from the cautious, hypervigilant boy who used to tiptoe through the Connecticut mansion, constantly terrified of triggering one of Declan's explosive, unpredictable outbursts. He was running across the manicured green lawn, his laughter ringing out clear and unrestrained as he chased a brightly colored soccer ball with a group of local children. His posture was open, his movements fluid and carelessly energetic. There was no flinching when a nearby dog barked sharply. There was no anxious scanning of the perimeter to gauge the shifting moods of the adults around him. He had filled out his cheeks, flushed with healthy color, his eyes bright, with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a safe, protected childhood. He shouted something in flawless, newly acquired French to his playmates, tumbling into the grass and giggling as the ball bounced over his sneakers. Watching him, a profound, overwhelming wave of validation washed over me. This was the sole reason I had orchestrated the entire extraction. Every calculated move, every covert financial transfer, every legal trap I had meticulously set was designed for this exact singular outcome. The absolute eradication of fear from my son's life was worth every risk I had taken. The soft, discreet chime of an incoming encrypted email drew my attention back to the tablet resting on the cafe table beside my sunglasses. The sender was my lead stateside counsel in New York. The subject line contained no legal jargon, just a single definitive word: concluded. I tapped the screen, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense official text of the attached federal court dockets. The prosecutors had not offered a shred of leniency, and the mountain of forensic evidence seized during the mansion raid was simply too overwhelming for even the most expensive defense attorneys to overcome. Facing the terrifying prospect of a drawn-out, highly publicized federal trial that would inevitably end in maximum sentences, the trio had completely caved. Declan, Richard, and Beatrice had all formally entered guilty pleas to an extensive list of federal charges, including massive wire fraud conspiracy and severe tax evasion. The federal judge, entirely unmoved by their former social standing or their pathetic courtroom tears, had handed down devastating, lengthy prison sentences. They were each looking at over a decade in federal penitentiaries, their assets fully liquidated to pay restitution, their reputations permanently destroyed. But the most crucial paragraph of the attorney's email was buried near the bottom of the summary. The convoluted web of fraudulent debt that Declan had maliciously opened in Leo's name, The fake credit lines and phantom accounts designed to tie my son to their criminal enterprise had been officially legally expunged. The federal court had formally recognized the aggravated identity theft. The judge had issued a sweeping order forcing the credit bureaus and financial institutions to wipe the slate entirely clean. Leo's credit, his identity, and his financial future were completely restored and insulated by a permanent federal protection order. The last remaining chain connecting my son to the Thorne family had been severed with the stroke of a judge's pen. I locked the tablet screen and placed it back into my leather tote. The ambient noise of the cafe, the clinking of silver spoons against porcelain, the melodic murmur of French and Italian conversation, the distant low hum of a passing ferry felt like a symphony of ordinary, beautiful freedom. I sat back in my chair, the Swiss sun warming my face, and watched Leo wave at me from across the park, his face splitting into a massive, carefree grin. I waved back a deep, resonant calm, settling permanently into my bones. He told me to apologize or pack my bags. I chose the bags, and it cost him his entire empire. The sheer arrogance that led Declan to believe I would simply submit to a lifetime of psychological subjugation was the exact fatal blind spot that facilitated his absolute ruin. He had assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness. He had mistaken my calculated patience for submission. I had walked out of a gilded cage carrying nothing but my son and a quiet, lethal determination. I had refused to be a tragic footnote in the Thorne family's legacy of abuse, a broken woman trapped by fear and financial manipulation. Instead, I became the meticulous architect of their downfall. The power of walking away, of refusing to negotiate with toxicity or compromise on my own sanity, had rewritten our destiny. I was no longer a terrified wife carefully navigating a minefield of domestic hostility. I was a sovereign woman, fully in command of my life, my wealth, and my family. I had stared into the darkest, most manipulative corners of wealth and entitlement, and I had emerged completely unscathed. The sun caught the sparkling surface of the lake, reflecting a future that was finally undeniably ours. The air was clean, the horizon was wide open, and for the first time in a decade I was truly completely free. The most profound lesson from this story is the liberating power of walking away from toxic environments. True strength is not measured by how much psychological abuse one can endure, but by the courage it takes to recognize your self-worth and refuse to participate in someone else's manipulative game. Gwen's journey illustrates that you do not need to fight abusers on their terms. Simply stepping out of their gilded cage is the ultimate victory. By establishing ironclad boundaries, you actively reclaim your peace and allow natural consequences to handle the rest. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to protect your peace? Share your experience in the comments below.